All right, welcome everyone. We'll get started here in just a minute, just letting everyone join the webinar today. All right, since it looks like it's 2 o'clock, we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome to today's webinar, Navigating the USDA Added Sugars and Sodium Limits in Your Menus. My name is Lesley Shiery. I am a registered dietitian and a nutrition manager at General Mills, and I will be your host and one of your speakers for the webinar today. And I'm glad to see so many people joining this afternoon. Clearly a popular topic. Before I jump in and give you a little bit more background about myself and my colleague, Chef Heather, who is also going to be joining me on the webinar today, I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping. So we'll have about 45 minutes of a presentation with content and the culinary demo. And then we're going to save about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A at the end, hopefully, if we can get through all the content. But anytime during the webinar, you can feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A feature that you'll see in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. So I'll be checking that as we go along, and I'll moderate that Q&A at the end of our session. Following the webinar, you'll get an email that will be sent. So you'll get the survey, you'll get a copy of the slides, as well as your CEU certificate through ANFP. And so this particular webinar was approved for one CEU through ANFP. Just a note, we did not submit for CEU through the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. And then the references for the content are included in the last slide of the slide deck, and you'll receive that in the follow-up email as well. Okay, so with that housekeeping, I will move on to just give you a little bit more background about myself, who will be speaking today, as well as Chef Heather, who will be joining me later to do a culinary demo, because she always gets the fun part. So like I said, I'm Lesley Shiery. I am an associate nutrition manager here at General Mills, and I'm in our Bell Institute of Health and Nutrition. And we are a team of registered dietitians and nutrition scientists, and really our role is to be the health and nutrition source for the company and for our brands and our partners across the company. I've been at General Mills for almost 11 years. I help to support our food service business currently, and I've been doing that for the past 5 years, which a big piece of that is helping to support on the K-12 side, which is super fun. I've also held similar roles, helping to support on the retail side for our cereal and yogurts businesses. I have experience in clinical dietetics, retail dietetics, and also working for a public relations firm. I have an undergrad in dietetics from Michigan State University and a master's in nutrition communications from Tufts University. And I did my dietetic internship at Yale New Haven Hospital in Connecticut. Unfortunately, we didn't get to do a school meals rotation, which we should have. That would have been amazing. But that's enough about me. So let me tell you a little bit more about Chef Heather. So Chef Heather Swan recently joined General Mills as a K-12 corporate chef, and I think actually it's been over a year now, maybe. But she most recently worked in a large local Minnesota school district, creating recipes and training staff. Chef Heather brings the perspective of the K-12 operator to General Mills Foodservice. Chef Heather is a graduate of the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park, New York. She has a wide variety of experiences that include working as an executive chef and general manager in resorts, fine dining restaurants, and a wood-fired Neapolitan pizzeria. Additionally, Chef Heather has experience in senior care dining. Chef Heather enjoys bringing on-trend flavors to K-12 school food and creating recipes that surprise students. And so she'll have some great menu solution ideas for you at the end during the culinary demo. So that's a little bit about us. Here's what we're hoping that you'll take away from the webinar today. So here's our objectives. We're really hoping to give you a deeper understanding of the USDA limits for added sugars and sodiums. And maybe you've seen this, in other presentations, but I think always good to have a refresher and reminder as these are coming into play quite soon as we think about next school year and the school years beyond that. We'll have to start implementing these into menus. Identify if there are products that meet these new product-based added sugar limits. I think that's a question that we get a lot. Are there products going to be available that are going to meet these? What are some strategies for menu planning to meet the weekly added sugars and sodium limits? So hopefully we'll give you some tools and tricks that maybe can help as you think about your menus and implementing these. And then another question that we get a lot is around, can I still incorporate those student favorites and meet these limits? So there's a lot of items that my students love. I'm afraid I'm going to have to take those off the menu, and hopefully we can give you some insight into that. And lastly, just to take away some tools and resources and maybe some new menu solutions that you can incorporate into your own menus and as you think about planning for future school years. So I always like to kick it off and just talk a little bit about the background and, why are these changes being made to the nutrition standards or, even part of the nutrition standards in the first place. And so as you all know, that school meal nutrition standards or nutrition standards for any child nutrition program needs to align to the dietary guidelines for Americans. And that's really what USDA did with this last final rule, was to say, do the nutrition standards for child nutrition programs align to the 2020-2025 dietary guidelines, being that those are the most recent ones? Now, we may have new ones coming out this year, we'll see, but these are the latest ones. And when you look at those, when it comes to added sugars and sodium, there's pretty clear guidelines around limiting those within a daily diet. And so you can see here for added sugars, that's less than 10% of calories per day, starting at age 2. And you can see how this got applied when it came to school meals as you think about that weekly added sugar limit, which I'll talk about. That will go into effect for school year 27-28. Really USDA taking that and saying, let's apply that at the breakfast occasion, let's apply that at that lunch occasion, so that we can translate and make sure our school meals are best aligned to dietary guidelines. And for sodium, you can see it's less than 2,300 milligrams per day for those 14 and older. And then it's lower for those age 4 to 8 and 9 to 13, with the 1,500 milligrams for ages 4 to 8 and 1,800 milligrams ages 9 to 13. And so that's why we see, these sodium standards, these added sugar standards, because it's really a great time to help, promote these healthy eating habits, is really starting in those childhood years. And so these translating into those child nutrition standards. And of course, you can see saturated fat is another one, which you all are also managing within your menus as well. So I want to dive into the added sugar standards, and we're going to start with those product-based limits. And so some questions that, I'm going to kick off each section to talk about, what are some questions that we commonly hear around some of these standards. So as you look at this first one, as we think about those product-based limits, some questions that we might hear of like, do these only apply at breakfast? So we see that it's for breakfast cereal, it's for yogurts, so maybe more commonly at the breakfast occasion. Is this only at breakfast? Do these limits apply to other grain-based foods, such as cereal bars? So I'm serving a particular cereal. If I have a cereal bar in that same brand, do those limits also apply to that cereal bar? So I'll talk through that. And then, are there products available to meet these limits? Are manufacturers making changes to their products to be able to meet these limits? So hopefully we'll address all of these questions as we go along in this first section. So as we look at these added sugar product-based limits, just as a reminder of what are they? So there's these 3 product categories that have the product-based limits that go into effect next school year. So school year 25-26, which starts July 1, 2025. So you have breakfast cereal at less than 6 grams of added sugar per ounce, yogurt at less than 12 grams of added sugars per 6 ounces, and then flavored milk at less than 10 grams of added sugars per 8 fluid ounces. And so this applies whether you're serving a cereal or yogurt at breakfast, you're serving it at lunch, or you're serving it in the NSLP after school snack program. So you have to serve any yogurt or cereal that you serve needs to meet these particular standards. And then for CACFP, it's cereal and yogurt. There was no change to the flavored milk standards for CACFP, and that goes into effect October 1st, 2025. And that's to align with the CACFP calendar. So just again, it's these 3 product categories. So then when you say, well, what about some of these other product categories, such as muffins or quick breads or waffles, French toast, pancakes? And so there aren't product-based added sugars limits for these particular categories, though that's not to say that USDA didn't consider the added sugar within these products. It's that these products are going to need to fit in those weekly added sugar standards or limits that go into effect in school year 27-28. So to go back to my question from the beginning of, okay, if I serve a cereal bar that's Cinnamon Toast Crunch, does that need to meet the breakfast cereal product-based added sugar limit? And the answer is no, it does not, but it will need to fit within that weekly added sugars limit when that goes into effect. So again, it's just those 3 product categories that have the product-based limits. Other categories need to fit within the weekly added sugar limits when those go into effect. And I'll talk more about those in the next section. And then I always like to give a little reminder on the label reading because we do see a lot of confusion around label reading when it comes to added sugar versus total sugar. This is, I guess I would say, relatively new to the label where added sugar was added when FDA did their latest nutrition label reform. And so it's always a good reminder that total sugar will include both naturally occurring sugar in a product and any sugar that is added by the manufacturer. So to give you an example, a flavored yogurt or a flavored milk is going to have natural sugar from the lactose in it, but will also have added sugar that's been added in for flavoring or for other purposes. So added sugar plays a number of different roles within a product beyond flavor, but that total sugar is really going to encompass both of those. That added sugar is really only what's been added by the manufacturer. And so we really want to pay attention to that added sugar line, because that's what the weekly limit is, as well as those product-based standards are focused on. So really in that green, that number 2. And I'd like to give a few reminders about label reading is that, again, we want to pay attention to that added sugar amount. I would say there is one exception. So if you see something like a single source of sugar, such as maple syrup or honey, you're only going to see total sugar on that because no additional sugar has been added. However, if you are using these as, on top of pancakes, you're using them in a recipe, those are going to count towards that weekly added sugar limit. So always keep that in mind. On those particular products, you won't see added sugars on the label, but as you put them into recipes or kids are using them on their pancakes or as a condiment, those are going to count towards that weekly added sugar limit. Otherwise, really pay attention to that added sugars amount. And then, of course, pay attention to the serving size. So as we talked about those product-based added sugar limits, you can see that it's based on 1 ounce of cereal, it's based on 6 ounces of yogurt. So if you're serving a yogurt that's 8 ounces or you're serving a yogurt that's 4 ounces, you're going to need to do that math to understand, does it meet based on that 6 ounces? Or if I'm serving a 2-grain cereal, which I'll show you an example of that, I'm going to need to do the math to understand, does it meet based on that 1 ounce amount? Of course, you can always talk to your manufacturers, talk to your distributors. They're able to help you to understand some of those products too. And then don't add the total and added sugars together. So we've seen this happen sometimes where people are adding them together, and really that total sugar already includes added sugars. So you really would be double counting that added sugar if you're adding them together. And it would look like a product has much more sugar than it actually does have in it. And then on the label, you always see that percent daily value. That's really based on someone would be on a 2,000 calorie diet. That percent daily value would be 50 grams of added sugar because that's 10% of 2,000 calories. And that's really giving you that percentage out of that 50 grams. So you can look at it, but it won't tell you whether something actually fits within that weekly added sugar limits. A product could have 11% of the daily value, and it could still fit within that weekly added sugars limit because your breakfast menu may have more or less than that 50 grams that percent daily value is based on. So just a couple of tips and reminders as you are reading labels and thinking about these product-based standards as well as the weekly limits as well. So this is just to give you the example of okay, does it meet? And this is the example of, this is a 2-grain cereal cup. And so the serving size is 56 grams. 1 ounce of yogurt or 1 ounce of cereal, is 28 grams. And so this is a 2-ounce cup. And so we need to do that math and say, this has 11 grams per 56 grams. And we need to convert that to the 1 ounce serving of 28 grams. And when we do that, we can see that yes, this particular product meets, that it's falling below that 6 grams of added sugars per 28 grams. If I were just to look at the label and say, and not pay attention to the serving size and say, okay, it has 11 grams, this exceeds the 6 grams, it doesn't meet. But that's not the case because it's that two grain versus the standard being based on 1 grain. And so really want to make sure we're paying attention to that serving size as well. And similarly, like I mentioned, would need to do that with yogurt as well. And this is just to give an example of, if we look at a yogurt, if I were just to say, look at the total sugars, I would think, okay, it has 14 grams for 2/3 cup, which is about 6 ounces or 170 grams. And I would say this particular product isn't meeting the standards. But we want to look at that added sugars line of the 8 grams. And so we can say, okay, this has 8 grams per 170 grams or 6 ounces. Yes, it falls below that 12 grams of added sugars per 6 ounces. So it meets the standards. So just to give you some flavor for, thinking about these label reading reminders and tips and tricks of like, how does this kind of play out when we're looking at labels, and how do we think about this and whether a product meets those product-based added sugar limits. Okay, and then if you might say, well, are there products available to meet these? And this is just, from our side of things, that we do have a number of different products that are meeting the cereal and yogurt product-based added sugar limits. And so you can find this on our General Mills Foodservice website, but we have 24 regulation-ready cereal SKUs, 10 regulation-ready yogurt SKUs. And so this is the resource that you can find and we can provide to you as well. But just to give you a sense that there are manufacturers out there that are working to meet these product-based added sugar limits and working to help provide products that students love to be able to meet the standards. Okay, so now let's flip to navigating the weekly added sugar standards. This one's a little bit more complicated, but I think it's something that you all are probably used to thinking about and implementing within your menus as you think about how you're managing sodium within your menus, or you're managing saturated fat within your menus. This snapshot here is from the School Nutrition Association School Nutrition Trends Report that they recently did, where they asked operators, how concerned they are about implementing some of the new nutrition standards from the final rule. And you can see, 64.6% of operators report serious concern about implementing the weekly added sugars limits. And that's, of course, not surprising. It's something new. It's one other, piece that needs to be managed within menus. But it can be done. And so let's kind of dive in to talk a little bit more about that. And so first, again, what are some questions that we were hearing about these weekly standards? How do I even determine the percent of calories from added sugars? And of course, I know you're going to have menu analysis tool and software that can help you in planning your menus and figuring out, what is that percent of calories from added sugars. I'm going to give you a super simplistic, example within, the next few slides where I'll talk about, well, how do you kind of look at it? If we just wanted to look at a day and say, okay, let me just take one day and see what is what's happening within my menu, and is it meeting that percent of calories from added sugars? Are there products that fit in these weekly added sugars limits? How am I going to be able to figure this out? What changes am I going to need to make to my menus to be able to meet the weekly added sugars limits? And so let's talk through a few of these. So just as a reminder, what those standards are, so it limits added sugars to less than 10% of calories across the week on average at lunch and at breakfast. So at the breakfast occasion and at the lunch occasion. And so you can see here, if you were to look at that breakfast weekly added sugars limits, you could see if it's grades K through 5, if on average your breakfast menu was 500 calories, that would equate to about 12.5 grams or less of added sugars on average across the week that you would need to meet. Looking at an older age range of grades 9 to 12, if on average your menus were 600 calories, that would be 15 grams of added sugars or less on average across the week. And then you can see at lunch, there's a little bit more leeway, being that there are higher calorie levels within that lunch occasion. And when USDA looked at where are the sources of sugar when it comes to added sugar within the school meal program, breakfast tended to be a little bit higher versus lunch, just knowing that oftentimes at the breakfast occasion, it tends to be a little bit more sweet compared to lunch. So implementation timing is school year 27-28. So have a few years to figure it out, but always good to start to think about this as well. And again, it's all those product categories that will need to fit within the weekly added sugars limit. So even those products that have a product-based added sugar limit, they'll need to fit within the weekly standard as well. So any kind of product that you're serving at that breakfast or lunch occasion will need to fit in for that added sugar limit. And so as we say, okay, well, what's really a simplistic way? Again, of course, I know you'll have tools that'll help you to do this, and so don't need to do the manual math. But if you wanted to get a sense check, you can simply kind of take a menu and look at, what are the percentage of calories from added sugar that's in one of my menus or within a week of a menu. So this is a really simple example. I'll give that caveat. But you want to have your data. Of course, you want to know how many calories you have, what is your total added sugars. And then you have calories per gram of sugar is 4. So you would take, I have 8 grams of added sugar in this breakfast. I'm going to times that by 4 calories per gram of sugar, which gives me those 32 calories from added sugars. And then I'm going to take that 32 calories from the added sugars in my breakfast menu and divide that by the total calories of 420 times by 100. And this tells me that this particular menu at this one occasion has 7.6% of calories from added sugar. So just for this one day, it falls below that 10%. But again, you're going to have to think about this across the week and how do you balance that across the week. But if you wanted to get a sense of a few days of your current menus of kind of what that looks like, you'll have this slide to be able to try to kind of figure that out. All right, so as we think about this weekly added sugar limits, I think a lot of things that you're probably doing when you think about saturated fat or you think about sodiums in your menu are really going to apply here as well. And so I think the biggest thing, as I've created a lot of different menus here, is just to think about that balance across the week. And so it's not about necessarily that I need to eliminate all of my student favorite items, but it's really of like, how do I balance that across the week? I might have a day that's higher in added sugar, but I can balance that out with a day that's lower in added sugar, and I can still meet that weekly added sugar limits. And I'll show you an example of that. And then it's about looking at your menus and your recipes now to say, are there small tweaks that I can make that can really make a difference? So sometimes I've found as I've been doing some of these, it's just a tweak of 1 or 2 grams of added sugar, and I can meet that particular standard. And so is it looking at, are there modifications or swap to condiments? So if you think about particularly at breakfast, if we have maple syrup or honey or jams or jellies, those can contribute to the added sugar of our menus. Is there a swap for those condiments? Or can I create a menu solution that doesn't maybe necessarily require those condiments? And I'll show you some examples of that. Are there ways to boost sweetness with spices and extracts? So think about vanilla or cinnamon or nutmeg, or maybe, if you think about what you're doing for sodium, of you have a spice rack for sodium, is there a spice rack when we're thinking about from a sweets perspective, and how can I give those spices that can enhance the sweetness of menu items that I'm serving? Can I look at my recipes to say, can I take and swap if I'm using a cup of sugar in a quick bread? Can I use half fruit puree and half the sugar? And so what are some small modifications or tweaks that I can make within my menus to be able to reduce that added sugar? And then, of course, I would encourage you to use your manufacturer, your distributor partners to understand, how do products fit within the weekly standards? Maybe they've already done that. Maybe they have sample menus that they can share with you to be able to help you get an understanding. So here's just an example of, a very straightforward menu that, we've created to say, how do these items fit within? Can I balance the added sugar across the week? And that's really to give that example here around balancing added sugars across the week. So at the very last line of the slide, you can see we've looked at, what's the amount over or under that 10% on that particular day. So for example, on Wednesday, we were over that 10% by 4.5%. But if you look at Tuesday, where we only have 2 grams of added sugar, we were under that by close to 8.5%. So it's really about balancing this across the week. So you can see we have a couple days where we're over that 10%, but because we have other days that are lower, we were able to balance that and still be below that 10% of calories from added sugar. This, of course, checking that and make sure it meets the other nutrition parameters as well, which we've done with this particular menu. But this is just to give you a snapshot of how do I balance this across the week? And like I mentioned earlier, what are some small tweaks that we can make? Okay, so typically maybe I serve pancakes with syrup, which the total is 26 grams of added sugar. What are some other unique ways that I could modify this particular recipe? Is it pancakes topped with yogurt and fruit where I can lower that added sugar? Do I do a sweet and savory of something that maybe is traditionally sweet? So an egg pancake taco. Can I do cinnamon apples on top of the pancakes instead of that syrup? And these are some recipes that can be found on our website as well. But just to give you some examples of, what are some small modifications that could potentially make a big difference, but still give kids that product that they love as well. Okay, sticking kind of in the sense of added sugars, I did want to talk about a couple of maybe hot topics, I guess I'll call them. One being grains at breakfast. As many of you know, that USDA gave the flexibility, starting, you can be doing it right now, to serve either grains or meat alternates or a combination of both at that breakfast occasion. And that was really to give you all flexibility in what you're serving in the menu, as well as an opportunity, it's another way that can help in lowering added sugar within those menus. But we do get some questions around this of like, do I need to serve more meat alternates at breakfast to meet this added sugar limits? Or I'm typically serving 2 grain items to meet the ounce equivalents over the week. Can these still fit within those weekly added sugar standards? And so I'll talk through these questions as well. But just as a reminder, there is that meal pattern flexibility. So you can serve grain, meat alternate, or a combination of both to meet the ounce equivalents over the week. And that went into effect this school year. So that could be something that you're implementing today. I would, just want to, give a shout out to grains and why they still are important when it comes to a nutrition perspective. When you look at nutrition research, grains are a top food source for iron, folate, select B vitamins, and particularly whole grains. We know that school meals are the place where kids are getting whole grains within their diets. In fact, kids who participate in the school meal program get more whole grains than kids who don't participate. It's the most whole grain dense source of foods. And so that's really coming through those grain products. And we want to make sure that kids are getting those whole grains, because if you look at research, whole grains are linked to better health outcomes. And so starting those healthy habits are important early on. They can be cost effective. So serving grains can help in managing menu costs and balancing saturated fat and sodium. So one thing I've noticed as I've done some of the menus is that, once I start to kind of swap in some meat alternates, sometimes the saturated fat and sodium in the menus can start to go up. I would say also they're a complement to meat alternates, really can create that balanced meal. The other piece, as we go back to the nutrition angle of it, grains are a source of carbohydrates, and carbohydrates are a source of energy. So as we think about what is the preferred source of energy for our minds, for active bodies, it really is carbohydrates. And so we want to make sure that, we are getting that kind of balance within those meal occasions that we're serving for students. And then those 2 grain products can still play a role. They can still fit within those weekly menus. I kind of showed that in that earlier example, but they can easily help to meet those ounce equivalent requirements over the week, as well as meeting those calorie requirements for older students. So this is just an example of bringing to life of, as we start to swap in some meat alternates, you can see we have a few days where, we have a cheese stick, we have egg, cheese, turkey, sausage, individually wrapped item. We have a breakfast biscuit sandwich. When I make a number of different swaps to swap in some of these meat alternates, we start to creep up a little bit on that saturated fat, pushing it above that 10%. Of course, we're pretty low on that added sugars line. And then sodium went above a little bit when we look at that school year 27-28 sodium targets. So again, it's just a shout out. That's something that we need to be mindful of as we start to make modifications to our menus. And of course, I would say it's a nutrition balancing act, right? And so any kind of change you make, it's going to change the nutrition of your menu. And so this is just to give you an example. We might have a 2 grain cup with fruit and milk. You can see what the nutritionals are there. If we swap out for 1 grain of cereal and 1 grain of something else, like whole grain rich graham crackers, we can see our added sugar actually went up a little bit, but our sodium went down. Now, if we swap in the cheese stick, we have a 1 grain cereal cup and we have a cheese stick for 1 mA. Now my sodium went up, my saturated fat went up, but my sugar went down. And so again, it's just kind of this balancing act. And so as you think about your menus, of course, you're probably doing this already. It really is kind of like, how do I meet all those meal pattern requirements and balance all the nutrition across as well? But we know you can do it because you're doing it already and doing a great job at that. The other piece I wanted to touch on is grain-based desserts. Some of the questions that we hear here are grain-based desserts creditable at breakfast? So many of you remember that the USDA had proposed limiting grain-based desserts and the breakfast occasion to less than 2 ounce equivalents per week at breakfast, similar to what's already in place at lunch. And so we get a lot of questions on so can I still serve these products at breakfast? Can I still serve them and meet the weekly added sugar standards? And then I'll talk about this too, but in the after school snack program, they will no longer be creditable for the NSLP after school snack program. So what can I serve in place of them? And so I'll talk through these. So just a reminder, Exhibit A of the grain requirements for child nutrition programs outlines, what are grain-based desserts and what are not grain-based desserts. So you'll have that, and I'm sure you are all kind of familiar with that guidance from USDA. But just want to reiterate that the only thing that was new in the final rule was that grain-based desserts are no longer creditable in the NSLP after-school snack program. Nothing else changed when it came to grain-based desserts, so they can still be menued at breakfast. That proposal to limit them to less than 2-ounce equivalents per week at breakfast did not get finalized in the final rule, so they can still be menued across your breakfast menus. They continue to not be creditable in CACFP. That has always been in place. And similarly, up to 2-ounce equivalents or less can be served at lunch. Again, that has a standard that's always been in place. And then they can be sold as smart snacks if they meet those smart snack standards. So again, the big change being that NSLP after school snack, where they will no longer be creditable. And then can they fit in? And the answer is yes. So this is just a sample menu where you can see by the star, there's some products that would fall under that designation of grain-based desserts under USDA guidance. And you can see I have 3 of them in this breakfast menu, and the breakfast menu is still falling below that 10% of calories from added sugar. So they can still fit within a menu. And oftentimes some of the things we see is that the nutrition profile looks very similar to something that maybe isn't classified, or sometimes it is a little bit better than something that might be classified as a grain-based dessert. But just to demonstrate, these can fit within a menu still, and that they can be menued at that breakfast occasion. And then if you participate in the NSLP after school snack program, you may say, okay, well, I was serving granola bars. What am I going to serve now? And so just to give some examples, if you were serving a granola bar with yogurt, can you find a loose granola that meets those product-based breakfast cereal limits to serve alongside that yogurt in place of that granola bar? Or you were serving a breakfast bar and milk. Is there a whole grain rich graham cracker and milk that could be swapped in? Or you're serving a cereal bar with an apple. Bowl pack cereal makes a great snack too. It's whole grain rich, it's fortified with vitamins and minerals, paired with fruit, can make a great after school snack as well. So just to give some ideas, if you were serving a granola bar, cereal bar in the after school snack program, there's some opportunities to make some swaps too. Okay, let's move on to talk about navigating the weekly sodium limits. This is one that you're probably very familiar with. You've been doing it for several years. But you can see here, this again is from the School Nutrition Trends Report that SNA recently did. You can see that close to 80% of operators are concerned about meeting the 27-28 school year sodium limits, which is understandable. You've been reducing sodium in meals for many, many years. And so to layer on, another downward change, can be overwhelming on top of having to do the weekly added sugar limits as well. But some of the questions that we receive, how can I modify my menus to meet these limits? Another question we receive, knowing that we provide biscuits to a lot of schools, that they're commonly on my menu. Can I still serve a breakfast sandwich and meet the sodium limits? What does that look like? And so let's kind of dive into some of that. So just as a reminder, so we're under this current, we have the sodium limits that you're following today, and those are in effect until July 1, 2027, when those new sodium limits go into effect. And so at breakfast, it's a 10% reduction, and at lunch, it's a 15% reduction. So you can see those new limits that will go into effect July 1, 2027. And if you remember back to the previous standards where you had that target 2, these standards on the effective July 1, 2027 really align to those target 2 limits that you can see there. And so I'm sure you're doing a lot of these things. I've seen some webinars recently of a lot of different creative things that schools are doing to lower sodium within their diets. Always a good time to kind of reassess and say, are there products or meals that are a little bit higher in sodium that I could make some tweaks to? So thinking back to, what we talked about when it came to added sugar, we implement some of those same kind of strategies to be able to lower sodium within our menus. So again, it's really about balancing across the week. So balancing those higher sodium days with lower sodium days, taking a look at menus to say, where are there items where maybe there could be a simple or, easy swap for a lower sodium item that still would, be something my students would love. When we think about that breakfast, I mentioned that earlier, but serving those lower sodium meat or meat alternates, if you do start to swap those in, and brunch for lunch sometimes can be a good way to get a lower sodium day in, and I'll show you those examples as well. But I'm just going to take you through some sample menus that I did. So this is just a breakfast menu where you can see we have a muffin, we have a egg breakfast biscuit sandwich on Tuesday. On Wednesday, we have waffles, we have a bagel with cream cheese, we have chicken and waffle sandwich. So you can see this would exceed, if we look at those 27 to 28 school year targets, it would exceed for grades K through 5 and grades 6 through 8. So we can see we have a day, Tuesday, which is a little bit high in sodium. Friday is a little bit high, but not terribly high. So what can we do as we look across this menu to potentially make some modifications to our menu? And so here we could say, okay, is there a biscuit that's lower in sodium? My biscuit's a little bit high. Maybe there's something I could do to lower it. I'm serving chocolate milk every day. My kids love it, but it has a little bit more sodium. Can I cut back there? Is there another day that could be a little bit lower in sodium to balance that biscuit sandwich out? If we look at Thursday, we have a bagel with cream cheese. The cream cheese is adding some sodium, but maybe isn't, crediting in my menus. And so is there something that doesn't require a condiment or spread that I could kind of swap in there? And so that's what I did in this next sample menu, was to say, okay, let's make all those changes. Let's choose a lower sodium biscuit. So you could see, it went down quite significantly. On Thursday, I'll serve a muffin top that doesn't require a condiment. On Friday, I'll do a lower sodium menu item there. And then I'll serve chocolate milk on Friday, but maybe I'll just save the plain unflavored milk for the remainder of the days, and that chocolate milk can go into that lunch occasion. And so here you can see, after I made all of those changes, then we're compliant across all age groups. And you can see we got pretty low on the sodium. And so then you could say, well, do I actually need to go that low? Can I just make some of the changes and meet the targets? And for sure, can be done. So here I just chose a lower sodium biscuit, served less chocolate milk. I kept that bagel and cream cheese. On Friday, I swapped out for this scrambler egg and cheese, which was a little bit lower sodium than that chicken and waffle sandwich. And so you could see I'm still meeting those targets just by making some of the smaller changes across the menu as well. And then when we get into lunch, I feel like this one gets a little bit more challenging, as I'm sure you guys are well versed in. But here's a menu where we can say, okay, we're above the weekly average for all the different age groups. And when I look across my menu, where are some opportunities to make some swaps? For example, my Wednesday is pretty high with that tomato soup and grilled cheese. My Thursday is pretty high as well with the cheese tortellini and Alfredo. I'm serving condiments across, which sometimes can be a source of sodium. So again, I encourage you to look for, are there sneaky sources within my menus that I could kind of tweak and swap, which would make a big difference within menus. On Tuesdays, I'll just point out, sometimes tortillas can be higher in sodium. And so particularly if they're a flour tortilla, something like a corn tortilla or brown rice, which has little to no sodium in it, could be a good swap to make a big difference. And so that's what I'm noting here, was that on Tuesday, okay, could I serve tacos on a corn tortilla? On Thursday, instead of the cheese tortellini with Alfredo, can I just do a noodle with Alfredo sauce? On Wednesday, maybe I'm going to do brunch for lunch this day, because I have savory across the week and other occasions. I'm going to try creating my own condiment for that ranch, using Greek yogurt and some spices to make a ranch dressing that's a little bit lower in sodium. And so when I do all of those types of swaps, you can see we can meet that weekly average sodium limit. And so that's what was done here. So on Tuesday, we swapped in corn tortillas for those flour tortillas. On Wednesday, we did brunch for lunch with a waffle egg sandwich with Pillsbury waffles, eggs, sausage. We just did fettuccine noodles with that Alfredo sauce. And we did a homemade ranch, which had around 100 milligrams versus 270 in that commercial product. And so just a few small changes, and we are able to meet those targets. Now, I understand your menus are much more complicated than this, and you're serving multiple different menu items. But just to give you a sense of, are there some small opportunities where you can assess menus and make some small changes in menus? And this is just my example of brunch for lunch, that it can be a way to bring down the sodium in one of your days as you think about balancing it across the week. These are a couple examples from our website that you can find. So it's you have a mini bagel with a spinach salad and egg and milk. So that's 690 milligrams sodium, a chicken and waffles plus salad, apple and milk. So you can meet those meal requirements, but have a relatively lower sodium day and help to balance it across the week for other student favorites that may be a little bit higher in sodium. Okay, I'm going to flip through this one pretty quickly so we can give Heather enough time. But the one big question we get is around breakfast biscuit sandwich. Can I still serve this? My kids love it. This is just an example of one that we built. We have a buttermilk biscuit sandwich, an egg patty, American cheese, turkey sausage, delivering 2 grain and 2.75 mMA, has 975 milligrams of sodium. So, what are some things that we can do with the breakfast biscuit sandwich to make it work within our menus and bring down that sodium? Can we reduce the meal components? So just choose two. Is it just meat and cheese? Is it just cheese and egg? Is there a lower sodium biscuit out there? Can I replace that American cheese, which tends to be a little bit higher in sodium, with a cheese type that might be a little bit lower? Or if I'm low on time, is there a product out there that's been made and designed to meet these particular standards? And so just to give you some of those examples, so here, we're still using a buttermilk biscuit, but we reduced those meal components. And you can see we went down by over 100 milligrams of sodium just by doing that. And then here it's like, okay, can we find a lower sodium biscuit? And that's what we have here. So we have a Southern style reduced sodium biscuit at 320 milligrams, that egg and cheese, and we've reduced it even further. And so it can make a big difference just by making some of these small swaps. And again, you could, find an even lower sodium biscuit, swap out that American cheese for a cheddar cheese, which has a little bit lower amount of sodium, and you go down even a little bit further. And so some ways to make some small tweaks and modifications to menu items. And then this is just an example of, maybe there's products that are out there on, like, not every day I'm able to scratch cook, but I may want to use something that's individually wrapped and has been designed to fit within these limits. And so these are just a couple examples from our portfolio of the Pillsbury Scrambler egg and cheese, the egg, cheese, and turkey sausage. You can see it's 350 milligrams for the egg and cheese and 390, and can give you a relatively lower sodium menu item. And we have a lot of tools and resources on our website. You'll receive this deck so that you can navigate and find these, and so that you can see, what items we have to help you in meeting both the added sugar limits and the sodium limits. So I am going to pause here, and I am going to flip over to Chef Heather, who is going to do our culinary demo for today.
Hello. Thank you, Leslie, for all that great information. Through all of these changes, the one thing I keep having to remind myself is that when it comes to the sugar, it's cereal, yogurt, and flavored milk, and that's all I got to worry about. So thank you for all that and all the great information that you put into that deck. It's just such a great reminder and so much great information. So today, I'm just going to talk a little bit about as the weather's warming up here in Minnesota, we got above 50. So that was great. I was very happy for that. The other day, we're kind of thawing out up here. The outdoor ice rinks are no longer open because it's too warm. So um, I was thinking about brunch for lunch, and I thought as the weather warms up, sometimes we tend to eat a little bit lighter at lunch. So I thought of these little picnic baskets or picnic boxes, I will say, that are easy grab and go for students. And they're using our cereal bars here, right? So we have the cinnamon toast crunch one, which comes in a 2 ounce equivalent grain, which is great for at lunch. It's portable, right? They can stick it in their backpack, easy to go. And then we also do have 1 grain as well for morning time with especially the littles, the elementary size kids. But I thought about flavors that would go together with these cereal bars. And remember, with the cereal bars, there is no sugar guidance or requirements on those cereal bars. And so what I did here is I paired a cinnamon toast crunch. I'm going to open this up so you can see it a little bit better. Excuse the noise here. We've got a cinnamon toast crunch, 2 ounce equivalent grain. We've got our reduced sugar Parfait Pro vanilla. And we've also got a little bit of mango with some chili lime seasoning. And so these flavors together, right? They're on trend. They're looking for that sweet, spicy. It's a great on the go box they can take with them. This can be made up ahead of time by your staff in the morning. So it can help to curb so your lines, your hot lines aren't getting so long. And if a student needs a quick grab and go, they want to go take it outside if you have outdoor seating, it's kind of something nice to go all portable. The other thing I thought about as brunch for lunch are these mini bagels, right? The cinnamon cream cheese bagel. And I thought about it and I of what I would pair it with for lunch for with some protein. And so I did here in this little one. Sorry for the noise again. So I did the cinnamon cream cheese mini bagel with some ham and some pineapple, right? Those flavors, think about a cinnamon glazed ham or a pineapple glazed ham. These flavors kind of go together, but it's deconstructed, and then a little bit of veggies in there. And again, it's a great grab and go breakfast. It can be prepped ahead of time. These are thaw and serve. They don't need to be warmed. So morning staff coming in can get these all set up. They can even be set up the day before, right? And ready to go in the morning when it's time to go. The other thing that I think about at brunch for lunch is we've got these the scramblers, the eggs, right? And I like to serve it with salsa. I like to dip it with the salsa. I like a little bit of the spice and the heat with the egg and the cheese. And we're finding that students really like that too. So just something nice to add on to that. That is a one meat, two grain, so it will work at your elementary schools, even at breakfast for those secondary schools as well. And obviously, the tried and true parfait is always popular too. And remembering that we do have that reduced sugar parfait pro vanilla that does meet the requirements, so it's easy to still keep giving them that parfait or a smoothie, which are easy to go in the morning or even at lunchtime. And as Lesley said, we do have a number of 2 grain cups that are ready to go that do meet the regulations and are ready to go. And I like to use these in a la carte too, right? If you menu them in the morning, we can sell them at lunchtime in the a la carte line. And it's great for student athletes like to take them for an easy snack before practice, and it fills them up and helps to give them that energy from those carbohydrates there. Thank you for joining us today. I'll kick it back to you, Lesley.
Great. Thank you, Heather. So it looks like we have some time for Q&A. So I see a few questions that I will address here. So let me just go into the Q&A. So one question I saw was around, are the regulations for average weekly added sugar limits based on the planned menu or the weighted average or what was actually served to students? And you would do this similarly to how you're planning your menus for sodium or for saturated fat. So it really would be that weighted average. So it does get a little bit more complex than maybe some of my simplistic math as I was showing you some of my menus where, it wasn't necessarily based on a weighted average of what might be most popular with students, but you would do it similarly to how you're planning your menus for the other nutrition components as well. And then there was a question on, does granola count as cereal? And yes, so a loose granola would need to meet those product-based added sugars limits. And so that is something that you would want to look for as a granola that would meet those as well. And so if you are looking for a granola, there could be some options that are out there or coming soon out there, or using a cereal in place of a granola if you're not able to find one. So that is a good question. I think, another question was just around whether people would be able to get the slides, and you'll absolutely get the slides in the follow-up email. So feel free to look for that. And then, another question that we had was just, what are manufacturers doing to help in meeting some of these regulations? And, I would say there's a lot of innovation and renovation going on from K-12 manufacturers. We think of ourselves from General Mills. We've been doing a lot of renovation of our products to make sure that they meet those product-based added sugars limits, as well as innovating to provide new products such as those Pillsbury scramblers that I mentioned. We also have coming out with a logo that says K-12 regulation ready that will be found on cases for breakfast cereals, as well as you can find that on our website as you're navigating and perusing for products. So I would encourage you to check that out as well. But I would say, a lot of manufacturers are committed to providing products that meet these standards and helping you all to have those student favorites on your menus as you go to implement these standards as well. Um, and then I'll just throw one over to Chef Heather of just thinking about, added sugars. Are there any other recommendations that you have on like cooking techniques or flavorings that we could be considering as we're modifying our menus?
This is a great question. With lots of frozen commodity fruits and stuff that might be hanging out in your freezer, pureeing those fruits up and using those as a sauce is a great way to add that sweetness, but without added sugar. Because remember, the fruit does not count as added sugar. So that's just a great way to add, you know, doing like a blueberry puree over your pancakes instead of syrup is a great way.
Yeah, I love that. And then I see there was a question around just explaining a little more why the cereal bar added sugar doesn't need to be taken into account. And I would say it's not that it doesn't need to be taken into account, it's just that it doesn't need to follow those product-based added sugar limits for breakfast cereals. But a cereal bar will need to fit within those weekly added sugar limits when those go into effect in school year 27-28. So that's where it will need to be taken into account for. Hopefully that makes sense there. There was an ask on if it would be recorded, and yes, this is recorded, and we'll have that recording up as well in the next few weeks or so. There was a question on figuring out added sugars in a recipe when maybe you don't have all the data, and that does get tricky. I will say that a lot of times, sometimes, or not a lot of times, in some cases, databases wouldn't have the added sugars in them, but I know, some database companies are working to get that added in. So it does get a little bit tricky as you're looking at recipes, particularly if you have some items where the added sugar isn't listed on the label or it's not within a database. You could look at the USDA nutrient database where it may have the added sugar content. Um, but that is a great question, and I know, that's since added sugars has been added to the label, they're trying to update various different databases to make sure added sugar is included there. Okay, those are most of the questions. I see a question about our website that is generalmillsfoodservice.com. So you can go there to find recipes as well as some of those regulation ready tools that we mentioned. And we'll send a link to that too in the follow-up email as well. Those are the main questions I see. I'll give it a little bit of a pause here in case there's any others that come in. Or anything else, Chef Heather, that you wanted to add as you think about sodium or added sugars and menus
Oh my gosh.
from your
Um,
experience and working in schools?
I think one of the things like you talked about is creating your own signature sauce where you can control the sodium, was something that we really worked on. And we even gave it a fun name. We named it after the mascot of the school. And we tried to mimic, those popular quick service restaurants where students eat when they're not eating at school. So really, like you said, focusing on creating your own signature sauces. They can be made up, in a big Cambro, stored in the cooler, and ready to go with that menu item. And it can be a participation driver too, right? Because if it's only served on a certain day with a certain menu item, that can really drive your participation because it's special. It's not something that's available all the time. So I found I had great success with that.
That's great. I love that. Super fun. Yes. A lot of creative ways I feel that
Yeah.
operators are managing sodium and getting
Yes.
students involved and making it fun.
And even creating that umami flavor, right? If you're looking for some more of that sodium flavor, mushrooms can be a little, iffy with students, but even adding in that savory flavor can help to get that sodium taste in the dishes without actually adding that extra sodium is another way too.
That's great. I love that. And I saw there was a follow-up question on the granola around, I think just looking for like, is there one available? And I will say that yes, we will have a 25% less Nature Valley cinnamon granola that will meet the product-based added sugar limit. So be on the lookout for that. So super exciting. There is something that will meet those standards so that you can pair that with your yogurt and still be able to serve that to students. And then there was just a clarifying question on the cereal bar and regular cereal. Is it just because it's a bar and not loose cereal? Yeah, I mean, how a bar is formulated is a little bit different than a breakfast cereal. And so I think that was the consideration as USDA put in the product-based added sugar standards, that how, a bar formulation looks a little bit different than a breakfast cereal. And so they didn't put in product-based added sugar limits for bars, whether it's a granola bar, cereal bar, those kind of all fall into one category. And then someone had a comment that they use sugar-free syrup on our brunch for lunch this school year, and their students didn't even notice a difference. I love that. All right. I think those are the main questions that I see, unless there's anything else. Otherwise, you can be on the lookout for the post-webinar email with the slides, and we'll have the link to the recording and your CEU certificate. And then if we didn't get to any of your questions, we can always follow up on those as well. But we appreciate everyone taking the time this afternoon to listen in, and hopefully you came away with at least a few nuggets to help you in managing these new standards that will be going into effect. And so we appreciate your time, and this will conclude our webinar for today.